The following program discusses population and demographic figures from the 1840 US Census. In 1840, the President of the United States is Martin Van Buren. In 1840, the United States extends from the Atlantic coastline westward beyond the Mississippi River. The states are shown here in blue, and the territories are shown in white. With the recent statehood of Arkansas in 1836, there are now 3 states west of the Mississippi River: Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana. The recent addition of the slave state Arkansas has been matched by the addition of the free state of Michigan in 1837. Thus, in the 1830s, Congress has again brought in 1 slave state, in this case Arkansas, and 1 free state, in this case Michigan, in order to keep the Senate equally balanced between slave and free states, the table now at 13 slave states to 13 free states. The United States has 26 states in 1840, so by 1840 the majority of the current 50 states have been added to the Union. The territories in 1840 are Wisconsin, Iowa, and Florida. British Canada is to the north, while a new republic, Texas, just recently independent from Mexico, is to the southwest. The far frontier is now at the Missouri River. In the far north are the Ojibwa. In the northwest are the Lakota Sioux and Mandan peoples, among other tribes. The Sauk and Fox are in the Iowa Territory, while the Omahas and Pawnees are to the west. The Osage are in the Central Plains west of Missouri, and the Cherokee, Creek, and Choctaws are west of Arkansas. Many of these southwestern peoples had been recently removed to the frontier west of Arkansas in the 1830s, the infamous Trail of Tears. Across America, new canals and a new network of steam-powered railroads is moving people and products across the continent at a speed never known in any previous age. Thus, the 1840 census is showing a nation that is in motion unlike any population in human history. There were 17 million people living in the United States in 1840, a 33% increase from the previous census in 1830. We will start with state populations, going from the most populous state to the least populous states. New York State is called the Empire State for good reason. In 1840, New York State boasted a population of 2.4 million residents, by far the largest state population in the nation. Pennsylvania was the second largest state with a population of 1.7 million. Ohio, a frontier landscape just a few generations previous, is now the 3rd largest state in the nation with 1.5 million citizens. Virginia, by far the largest state in the South, has a population of 1.2 million in 1840. Eastern Virginia has a population of 807,000, while the mountainous western part of Virginia has a population of 433,000. Tennessee, in the middle of the country, has a robust population of 829,000 people. Kentucky had 780,000 souls in 1840. North Carolina was home to 753,000. Massachusetts had 738,000 citizens in 1840. Georgia had a population of 691,000 in 1840. Indiana had 686,000 citizens. South Carolina had 594,000 souls. Alabama had 591,000 in 1840. Maine was home to 502,000 citizens in 1840. Illinois, just a generation after its frontier status, was home to 476,000 people. Maryland had 470,000 residents. Missouri had 384,000 souls in 1840. Mississippi had 376,000 residents. New Jersey had 373,000 residents in 1840. Louisiana had 352,000 souls. Connecticut had 310,000 citizens in 1840. Vermont had 292,000 inhabitants. New Hampshire had 285,000 citizens in 1840. The new state of Michigan, 3 years after her statehood, already had a population of 212,000 people. Rhode Island had 109,000 residents. Arkansas, just 4 years into her statehood, had 98,000 residents. Delaware had 78,000 residents in 1840. We will now examine the territories. Florida Territory, which had been part of Spain for centuries, is a United States territory in 1840. There were 54,000 people in the territory of Florida. The territory of Iowa had a population of 43,000 settlers. The territory of Wisconsin, spelled with a K in the census, had a population of 31,000. We will name cities with populations exceeding 15,000 residents, as these would have been the largest population centers in the country in 1840. It's also important to remember that some large cities, like New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia, can have different populations based on whether adjoining metropolitan neighborhoods are included in the count. New York City proper, defined here by the boundaries of New York County, which includes Manhattan, had a population of 313,000 citizens, the largest city in the nation. Again, this number is just New York County, and the 313,000 figure does not include adjacent counties or Long Island. Philadelphia County, incorporating the city of Philadelphia and its nearby neighborhoods, has a population of 258,000 people in 1840. Baltimore, Maryland had 102,000 residents. New Orleans, Louisiana is the largest city in the Deep South by far, with 102,000. Boston, Massachusetts had 93,000 people in 1840. Cincinnati, Ohio had a population of 46,000, the largest city in the Northwest. Brooklyn, New York, distinct here from New York City, had a population of 36,000 people. So Brooklyn, by itself, is one of the largest cities in the country. Albany, New York, had a population of 34,000. Charleston, South Carolina, is one of the major ports in the South, with 29,000 residents. The national capital, called Washington City at the time, had some 23,000 residents. Providence, Rhode Island, had 23,000 citizens in 1840. Lowell, Massachusetts had a population of 21,000. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania also has 21,000 residents in 1840. Down the Ohio River is Louisville, Kentucky, the same size as Pittsburgh with 21,000. Richmond, Virginia had a population of 20,000, the largest city in that highly populous state. In New York State, the development of the Erie Canal has yielded large cities across the state. We will take a closer look at New York State. Rochester, New York had a population of 20,000. Troy, New York was home to 19,000. Buffalo, New York had 18,000 citizens. We will step back to the national view. Newark, New Jersey had a population of 17,000. Salem, Massachusetts had a population of 15,000 in 1840. St. Louis, Missouri was already a major city in the nation and the prime hub on the Mississippi River with 16,500 residents. Portland, Maine had 15,200 citizens. We will now mention the largest cities in other states not yet mentioned, where city data is available. These cities demonstrate the scale of large town sizes in 1840. New Haven, Connecticut had 13,000 citizens. Mobile, Alabama had 12,700 residents. Savannah, Georgia had 11,200 residents in 1840. Detroit, Michigan, which had been a French fort in colonial times, then a British fort, then a part of Canada, and now part of the United States in 1840, had a large population of 9,000 people. Wilmington, Delaware had some 8,400 residents. Portsmouth, New Hampshire had some 7,900 residents in 1840. Nashville, Tennessee was home to 7,000. Wilmington, North Carolina is the largest population center in that state with 4,800 residents. Natchez, Mississippi had 4,800 people. Chicago, Illinois has a population of 4,500 in 1840. Burlington, Vermont had some 4,300 citizens. New Albany, Indiana, across from Louisville, Kentucky, was the largest city in that state with 4,200 citizens in 1840. St. Augustine, founded by Spain in 1565, had a population of 2,500 in 1840. The Constitution required that the census tabulate slaves so that representation based on 3/5 of that population could accurately be apportioned. Thus, we know how many slaves and free African Americans were present in each state in 1840. In the nation as a whole, there were 2.5 million slaves, or about 15% of the total population was enslaved in 1840. There were 386,000 free African Americans in the United States at this time, so about 15% were freemen in 1840. We will arrange the states from the least slavery to the most slavery by a percentage of state population. All northern states in 1840 had either no slaves or slave populations below 1%. Maine had 0 slaves in 1840 and some 1,400 free African Americans. Massachusetts has 0 slaves and some 8,700 freemen. Vermont also had no slaves in 1840 and 730 freemen. The new state of Michigan had 0 slaves as promised by the Northwest Ordinance. Michigan had 707 free African Americans in 1840. New Hampshire had 1 slave in the entire state, and there were 537 freemen in New Hampshire. Ohio had 3 slaves in 1840 and some 17,000 freemen. Indiana also had 3 slaves and some 7,200 freemen. New York State had 4 slaves in a state of 2.4 million residents. New York had legislatively ended slavery in the 1820s, and the state's former slaves were now freemen. Thus, there were some 50,000 freemen in New York State in 1840. Rhode Island had 5 slaves and some 3,200 freemen. Connecticut had 17 slaves and 8,100 freemen. Pennsylvania had 64 slaves within a state population of 1.7 million. There were 48,000 free African Americans in Pennsylvania. Illinois had 331 slaves, less than 1% of the population. There were 3,600 freemen in Illinois. New Jersey had 674 slaves in 1840, the most slaves of any northern state at that time, yet this was still less than 1% of the state population. New Jersey by 1840 had significantly reduced the number of slaves in its state. New Jersey had 21,000 free African Americans. Delaware had 2,600 slaves in 1840, about 3% of the population. On the one hand, Delaware's slave proportion at 3% is exponentially higher than any state to its north. On the other hand, Delaware's slave population is by far the lowest percentage compared to other slave states. Delaware had 17,000 free African Americans, meaning that there were over 6 times as many freemen in Delaware as slaves in 1840. Thus, Delaware is more like New Jersey than Virginia. Missouri had 58,000 slaves, or 15% of the state was enslaved. Ironically, despite the congressional battle over Missouri's status as a slave state or a free state in 1820, Missouri, for a slave state, had a relatively low percentage of slaves as compared to other slave states. Missouri had 1,600 freemen. Maryland had 90,000 slaves in 1840, or 19% of the population was enslaved. Maryland had 62,000 free African Americans, the largest population of freemen in the country. So Maryland is an interesting case too. On the one hand, there is a large slave population, but there is also a large free African American population as well. 60% of African Americans were enslaved in Maryland, but 40% were freemen. So we can see this unique mixture of freedom and slavery in Maryland in 1840. Arkansas had 20,000 slaves, about 20% of the population, or 1 in 5 people in that state were enslaved. Arkansas had 465 freemen in 1840. Tennessee had 183,000 slaves, or about 22% of the population was enslaved. Tennessee had 5,500 freemen in 1840. Kentucky had 182,000 slaves in 1840, or about 23% of the population was enslaved. There were 7,300 freemen in Kentucky. North Carolina had 246,000 slaves, or 33% of its population, 1 in 3 persons, were enslaved. North Carolina had 23,000 freemen in 1840. Virginia had 449,000 slaves, or 36% of the population was enslaved. But there is an important distinction in Virginia on slavery. While Eastern Virginia had been established on tobacco cash crop for 2 centuries by 1840, Western Virginia in the mountain country is not suitable for tobacco agriculture. In Eastern Virginia, the slave population was 395,000, or 49% of the Eastern Virginia population was enslaved. But in Western Virginia, the slave population was 54,000, or 12% of the Western population was enslaved. So in the 1840 census, we see a stark difference in proportion of slavery between Eastern Virginia and Western Virginia. Virginia had 50,000 free African Americans, with some 42,000 freemen in Eastern Virginia and another 7,500 freemen in Western Virginia. So as an Upper South state, Virginia does have a large number of freemen. Georgia had 281,000 slaves in 1840, or 41% of the population was enslaved. There were 2,700 freemen in Georgia. Alabama had 262,000 slaves in 1840. About 44% of the population was enslaved. There were some 2,000 freemen in Alabama. Louisiana had 168,000 slaves, or about 48% of the population. There were 25,500 freemen in Louisiana, which is a much higher number of free African Americans than other states in the Deep South. Mississippi had 196,000 slaves, or 52% of the population was enslaved. So most of the people in Mississippi in 1840 were slaves. There were 1,400 freemen in Mississippi. South Carolina had 327,000 slaves, about 55% of the population being enslaved. So most people living in South Carolina were slaves, and that state had the highest proportion of slaves in the nation. South Carolina was home to 8,200 freemen. Let's examine the territories. The Wisconsin Territory had 11 slaves and 185 freemen. The Iowa Territory had 16 slaves and 172 freemen. The Territory of Florida had 26,000 slaves, or about 47% of the population was enslaved. The Florida Territory had 817 freemen in 1840. The United States had a total population of 17 million people in 1840. By this time, populations are rapidly expanding across the eastern half of North America, and the United States stretches beyond the Mississippi River. The territories in 1840 were Wisconsin and Iowa in the northwest and Florida in the south. Slavery has, statistically, become exceptionally rare in the north, with many states having 0 slaves. We can see a new issue on the horizon, however, as the free states have 2 territories, Wisconsin and Iowa, on deck to become states, while the slave states only have 1 territory, Florida, on deck to become a state. When Wisconsin and Iowa become states, this will tip the senatorial balance of power in favor of the free states. However, if the United States were to acquire the Republic of Texas, recently independent of Mexico, the senatorial balance between North and South would once again be preserved.